This bashing session was actually the final one I did for this tutorial set, and it was honestly the one I was most happy with, so I felt like I really needed to give you guys a voiceover of it. I actually began this one by having the duck, a pod racer, and one of the Kitbash 3D buildings. I immediately actually just selected all of the Kitbash 3D components there and merged them together by pressing Ctrl-J. After I did that, I decided I was going to use it as a large formal move in the Kitbash. I decided though to go into its edit mode after I had merged it, and I just grabbed half of it and scooted it out. And this was because I was already thinking about it as wings or some kind of sides to the duck. The duck here is really serving as a landscape. In a lot of ways, he's a mountain, and I was positioning this tower around the mountainous duck himself. Just spent a little bit of time composing that. I wasn't really sure where this was going at all, and it was just trying to generate something interesting. I turned my attention next to the pod racer, and I decided I wanted to isolate one of these pod components on the front. So I just go into its edit mode, select all those faces on the object, and separate. So you go to Mesh, Separate, or Control P. I was just taking a moment or 3 here to position these new pieces around, rotating them a bit, just to give them a little bit of randomness, which can add some interest. But again, I wasn't really sure where this is going. I knew I was going to merge this eventually, and so I went ahead and actually made a copy of the duck. I set him to the side. After that, I wanted to position this to give it a bit of a tail, like he was pulling this engine behind him. At this point, I decided to go ahead and remove some of the materials from the original objects, and I wanted to make a new material that I was going to use on everything. So I created a new material and named it Seafoam Green, and just made it a nice kind of green color. So there on the Kitbash 3D building, it had several different materials originally on the object, but I just went through and pressed the minus button on all of them and subtracted all of the materials out one by one. Then I just applied the Seafoam Green color to the whole thing at once. I decided I would add a few more pieces around, and he needed a hat, so I started there. Again, at this point, all of the moves you're really working through are formal and they're compositional. You don't really have to have anything specific in mind, and you can just have some faith in the process. I wasn't super happy with this at this point, but I just kept going. I didn't know where it was going to go, but I decided that it was worth it. Here I just went ahead and separated part of that mesh off. So I selected those individual components, and I just went to Separate in the Edit Mode options. After I separated that piece, I was just moving it and rotating it and positioning it around. Again, not really sure where this was going to go or what it might turn into. I did decide to actually just go ahead and merge all these objects together, which in hindsight maybe wasn't the smartest move to do this early, but I was going for expedience rather than cleanliness, and I just decided, yeah, we'll just go ahead and merge them. At this point, I went ahead and established a studio backdrop because I knew I wanted to really begin testing some of the render compositions. So I went ahead and extruded the back edge with the extrude tool and then beveled that plane just to have a nice infinite studio backdrop. I went ahead and scaled it out to the side too, just to give a little bit more horizontal space to work in. And since I was doing this already, I just went ahead and set up the sun to have 10 power and a nice soft angle for some good shadows. I was also just wanting to get a feel for what this would look like at each phase, so I did go ahead and swap over to the Cycles render engine too. Now, this part, I decided to experiment a bit with the material, and it yielded some really nice results. You'll see all I've done is I have that principled BSDF, and I added a red subsurface color. Then I added a subsurface value of about 0.36, and I was happy with how that looked. It gave it a really nice, soft sheen. I decided I would just roll with it. I didn't really change too many of the other settings. I changed the red to make it a little bit less saturated there, but I felt really good about that particular material. I decided, yeah, I'll run with it. It is important to note that because of that material, the renders were taking much longer to do, but it gave it a really nice quality. I was spending ample time just going through and testing different lighting setups. I was changing the angle a little bit just to make sure it felt like a proper infinite studio backdrop. And went ahead and this point, I wanted to go ahead too and get the camera established because it's time to start testing. I think testing rendering is such a crucial part of this process. Very much like in Unreal, where you want the real-time feedback. In this kind of kitbashing, you want that feedback to be as close to real-time as possible. And the only way to do that is to be operating from the camera you're going to capture from. As I'm doing these tests, I'm just saving them out. Again, because of that subsurface material, these renders were taking a while. They were each taking 13 to 15 minutes, but I was watching a TV show on the side, so it didn't really matter to me too much. It ended up being totally fine. One of the interesting side effects of the renders taking so long, though, is that you stare at the preview for quite a while, and it makes you interrogate and even as I'm rewatching this video, recording my audio, I'm like looking at it, and it's making me more and more critical of what I ended up with. So again, I wasn't really happy with how that form looked at the moment, so I decided that let's go wild with it. Let's do some stuff. Let's spice it up. I entered into the sculpting tools and just started going to town, not really respecting that original geometry very much, and I decided, we'll just go ahead and remesh. I put a blocks remesh modifier on and up the octree depth to 8. I felt like that looked pretty decent, but I would up it one more to 9 and apply. In hindsight, this is my one regret of the entire composition. I really wish I hadn't done that, but we did it and we went forward. I did make a copy of that though, and I was super happy with this one. And on the copy, by pressing Shift D to make a copy, I did another remesh modifier, but I set this one to sharp and gave it a very low octree depth, which made these really big, sharp edges of that same kind of form. After that, I made another copy and did a larger blocks remesh. So I actually have, I think, 4 versions of that same mesh stacked on top of each other in that same spot. Just slightly changed their positions, which gives us really interesting compositional overlay. After that, I decided it needed an unaltered mesh as a bit of a hero piece in the composition. So I actually grabbed one of those pod racer engines and put it right on top. Now, as I was going through the render, I was becoming more and more critical of some of the details that I started to notice. The formal language and the composition was pretty much established at this point, right? The large focal area on the left is making a sort of sharp and massive mountain, contrasted with the little bit of a tail that was coming off to the bottom. I did take a second to readdress some of these underlying geometries, so I just selected the individual mesh there and went to its edit mode. I did decide to finally save this file as I was starting to get a little happy with what was turning out, and I went for another render. Again, these renders were taking quite a while, and that's totally due to the subsurface material. I decided to go ahead and chop off the top of that mesh, and then I appended in and imported in another building from the Kitbash 3D pack. But this one I specifically knew I wanted some of the detail pieces off of it. These kits have a lot of really nice details, and particularly on this building I had already scouted out, it had some really good signs and antennas, so I knew I wanted those. I went ahead and actually just deleted out the rest of the components that I didn't need, and then I spent a second to individually separate those elements that I wanted. So I just grab one antenna, go to Mesh, Separate, and then I move it to the origin and set the origin to the 3D cursor. And that's just to bring the pivot point closer to the object's center. I then spent a second to isolate one of these signs. I knew it was going to be an important part of the composition, so I really wanted to separate it correctly. I kept accidentally missing some of the faces on it, but it was worth it, so I went ahead and reset its origin also. After that, I decided I would grab a few more of these detail pieces. There are a lot of really nice ones here, but I just settled on a few of the air conditioning components and those antennas and sign. At this point, I was starting to think, okay, where am I going to put these? This is definitely akin to the second pass of the modeling phase. The first phase was to establish the large formal moves, and now I was starting to think through some of those secondary details. As I was going through, I decided to go ahead and remesh another piece and push it down because the bottom area had a little bit more detail than I wanted it to have. I spent a second positioning some of these antennae around the composition because I knew that they would be some of the details that would give a little bit of visual interest. The sign felt really important to me, so I spent a bit of time positioning it there. And these kind of air conditioning components I was positioning around just for some additional details. I was getting a little bit worried about that bottom part, and so I just kept positioning and playing around with how that mesh sat with relation to the base. Once I re-entered into the camera, I decided I needed to reposition a bit and test out a render. So I allowed this one to run, and boom, I had forgot to relink those materials. So you can go to File, External Data, and go to that texture file. I wanted originally to see what that sign would look like with the original material, but the sign wasn't super interesting. It was like a grungy sign that looked like it was in the post-apocalypse. So I decided I would just go ahead and apply that same seafoam green texture to it eventually. Now I was starting to get into the next phase of more specifically modifying the individual geometries for the composition. I didn't really like how these faces were poking out from that voxelized building. So I started using some of the different tools, the edit tools and the sculpt tools, to push and pull those. Here you'll see that I'm just repositioning a few of the antennas around, knowing that those were going to be the little sprinkles. Those were the nice detail moments on the piece. The longer I was looking at it, the less and less happy I was, though, with all these little voxel components. And I started using the sculpting tools on that mesh to actually hide those into the other geometries. So I was just using the smooth brush and the deflate function. So I was using the inflate brush but holding control. And so between those two, I was just pushing those into the other geometry here and there, just not letting them take up too much attention from the composition. I went for another test here, and I was getting happier and happier with this, but I still did not really care for how much detail those voxels were giving the mesh. I decided it's time to take it to the next level. I did like how that subsurface green was looking, though, so I was not going to compromise on that. I decided I would take a second to try a liquid simulation, and so I actually picked one of the low resolution meshes. I picked the sharp remesh version of the mountain, which was giving it those really large, sharp forms that were underneath, and I was running a liquid simulation on it. So I set up this cube, which serves as the bounding box for the simulation, and this sphere, which is the source of the liquid. If you're interested in this, I encourage you to check out the liquid simulation tutorial set that I put up there on the drive. But the liquid simulations are honestly pretty easy, and they can yield some very cool results. And you'll see quickly, oh, I didn't set it up right, so I had to adjust some settings, and boom. That's what I was going for, but I decided I would spend a little bit more time and really fine-tune some of those settings to get it to cover the parts of the mesh I wanted it to cover. Each time I was tweaking those settings, I was getting happier and happier with it. This one I felt was super close, but I didn't like how it was running up against the edge of that bounding box. I went through a few more iterations of this. Ultimately, though, I was always thinking about the overall composition of the piece. I knew the liquid would be a smoothing operation, and so I was trying to allow there to be that relationship of the primary, secondary, and tertiary forms. The primary form, again, in this is really the mountainous shape with the tail coming off. The secondary are some of these larger regions, and even the detail of the building model that's on the front face becomes one of these large secondary regions. Here I finally upped the resolution on the simulation, allowed it to run, and I felt like this one was the winner. I felt like this one was pretty good. So I decided, oh, I spoke too soon. I decided to run one more. And after this one, I decided this one was the winner, and I would just roll with it. So I went into the liquid settings and I applied this liquid modifier. A lot of this is just a process of iteration, but once I had isolated it, I gave it that same seafoam green color and did a test render. I was pretty happy with how that was looking. I definitely liked it better than the voxels that it was covering, and I liked it so much more that I decided to go through and edit more of the voxels that were in the screen space. Then I wanted to adjust some of the other details that I had noticed weren't really to my liking. I finally did decide to smooth out that remesh, that cubic remesh, with the smooth brush, and then I added a textured brush to the sculpting tool to give it a little bit of spice. And I was much happier with that than the cubes, actually. After that, I positioned some more of the antennas around and was really starting to think through how that liquid was sitting on the piece. These antennas are the smallest details in the whole composition, and actually I knew they weren't really standing out on the white background, which I was keeping in mind each time I was rendering it. So I actually decided here to test out a yellow background, which I felt like actually looked pretty nice. But now I started noticing those huge globs of the liquid coming through in the front of the composition. After this test render, I knew those had to get addressed. I was still testing a lot of these different render settings and just trying out different colors of the background as I was going. At this point I wanted to see if the antennas would stand out more, and then I wanted to play with the shadows to try to change up the scene a little bit where I'd been staring at it for so long. So I'm finally addressing those liquids coming out of the front by just deleting some of those faces off. And yeah, I felt pretty good about that. But I knew it was still missing something, so I decided I would reposition a few of those antennas around in the composition now that they were more visible because of the purple background. Each time I was just making minor adjustments, tweaking the focal length, tweaking the margins, making sure it had ample margins to accommodate the object and some of its shadow as well. And then I added the coup de grace, the king himself upon his throne. And after that, I rendered out a couple more. But I know this video is long. I hope you find it useful and enjoy the process.